A Declaration of Non-Dependence by Mark Malone. The Philosophy of Sovereignty. America must leave all global governance initiatives and reclaim its destiny for the 21st century. To the living men and women of America. 1. Origin of the global governance problem. 2. The worldview underpinning totalitarianism. 3. Current state of the states. And 4. Returning to a transcendent mission. Introduction. It's very likely the contents of this essay will bring about a combination of confusion and rage in many. Indeed, if it doesn't, I suppose I'm not doing my duty correctly, because we're tackling what I consider the cardinal sin of them all, the ultimate endgame of all tyranny, the end of individual sovereignty, the end of autonomy, individual and collective, and the end of nations. Sound hyperbolic? Well, sir, madam, read on and determine for yourself. I would like to believe that the events from March 2020 onwards, worldwide and in America, have proven to people what the corporate government are capable of. Forced shutdown of independent businesses leading to Great Depression levels of recession and unemployment. $6 trillion in 1 year added to the national debt. Isolation camps, cargo and shipping shortages, not to mention coercing the entire population into a speculative, radical genetic therapy vaccine approved for emergency use only. Keep this in mind as we explore the endgame of this system, global governance, and not just its birthing pains that we're currently enduring. If the quality of your life has been reduced between 2020 and 2021, you can be assured it will be reduced significantly more should this technocracy fully manifest in the West between now and 2030. This is a meta-analysis, so for the sake of convenience and readability, or listenability, I will not be explaining in every detail how and why your life specifically will be affected by the problem outlined, merely making the case that our dependency on it and consent of it could bring about the end of the America we know and love, and the solution is more sovereignty. Now, as a newly adopted American, I'll be speaking from an American perspective, as that is my primary concern. That being said, I'm of course concerned for all nations, and much of what I'm saying here will apply to the all. I'm writing this, to be honest, because I'm desperate to get the conversation started for the sake of my children. Desperate for answers, desperate for solutions, and desperate to do all I can to shine light on the true workings of what I call the global state. An impending technocratic society awaits us if we do not understand the devil in the details, so I will explore those details. When we think of independence as it was detailed in 1776, we could think of an occupying army that is omnipresent and life-threatening, obstructing us from living our lives freely and peacefully. Despite the deep challenges our founding fathers faced, what they didn't face was elusiveness, and our restrictions are similar, but at present, less obvious, as not by gunpoint, instead, via democracy, be it economics, politics, culture, media, and corporate terms and conditions. The enemy we face is indeed elusive, deceptive and hidden in plain sight, invisible and insidious beyond measure. You may or may not know about the issue of global governance, the fully evidenced manifestation of a totalitarian private political partnership that will dissolve personal and national sovereignty. In either case, I will lay out here the worldview and the mechanics that underpin this present danger, in the hope that it will grant us the knowledge and faith to remain sovereign and free ahead of its full implementation. The purpose of my work isn't to pursue Americanism for its own sake. My primary hope for the work is actually a spiritual one. You may want to see spiritual as purely a transcendent philosophy, and if so, that works. It does not change the outcome of the goal regardless of labels. I don't believe we get out of this alive, though, through material means alone, and a huge segment of the problems we face are actually our own problems brought into the equation, our own drift into darkness, deception, away from the light, truth, has played an instrumental role in our fall into tyranny. If we can't be good in our own lives, how can society be good for anyone? Tyranny is born through the little things we let slide over time. Those little things become very big things in the aggregate. The corporate government oligarchs that are pursuing the agenda I'll outline here are fully aware that a population that can't take care of itself will need taken care of. This is the real foundation of totalitarianism, especially as we see it occurring today. Make no mistake, it's already here. It's just dependent on the depth that it affects you, whether you're aware of it or not, and the depth it will affect you as freedom declines. I'd imagine a significant portion of the public woke up to this fact during the 2020 lockdowns and restrictions, which will not go away, but morph over time into a permanent part of the culture unless it is stopped in its tracks. Consider 9/11. Did the measures introduced, be it the Patriot Act, or later the NDAA, or the TSA protocols, or the national debt or wars, ever go away? No. All that happened was they morphed over time and the enemy changed. So then did the justification for them through the drip-fed propaganda machine we call media. Averting the endgame, which is fully implemented global governance, is where we gain the real victory, though, and where this work and my priorities are focused. Valuing the highest good. I do believe in God, and believe God is the precursor to all that we value in life, truth and love, objectively into subjectively, which everything else good stems from. Keep that in mind when I'm describing the nature of the transcendent. The immaterial, eternal laws that govern reality are what I describe as our connection to the divine. Everyone has a God, whether they know it or not. Everyone does philosophy, whether they know it or not. You may not have a religious tradition, but that which you value highest and extract your highest value from will be your, quote, God, unquote. You may never have heard of Socrates, but whatever methodology you use to navigate the world will be your philosophy. What you make your God will determine how your philosophy shapes itself. Similarly, someone's God may be Krishna or Allah, or it may be socialism. Their philosophy then supporting their God could take many forms, from pacifism to activism, and collectivism to individualism. Their God may be, worst of all, themselves. The latter being the cardinal sin of even the Christian faith in many ways, as worshipping oneself in full hubris narcissism is the true Luciferian ideology that opposes God. If we fall into solipsism, our own subjective existence being all that matters, we have crossed over into a moral relativist ideology, where concepts like good and evil, and even true or false, are merely preferences. At that juncture, there's no possibility of truth and love, because you can't even justify them or define them. Love is about deep affection, including compassion and gratitude. It's not about permitting or accepting any and all desires and behavior. Love often requires tough love for the longevity of the individual's success, as opposed to the needs of the moment. Hence, truth with love is necessary. Curating a society anywhere that can be optimal for all is becoming near impossible due to this dangerous philosophy of solipsism and the hubris of worshipping oneself. While I do have a Christian cosmology, I also have respect for and indeed learn a lot from many schools of thought that I reference throughout this thesis. I learned from Marcus Aurelius, and credit, as do many scholars, his philosophical work to the foundation of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I also learned from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Max Planck, Carl Sagan, Wilfrid Sellers, and of course Thomas Paine. I do also understand much of God is outside of our comprehension, but with the limited awareness we do have, we can still paint a coherent picture. Each layer of truth from each discipline, be it biblical, scientific, philosophical, or psychological, should act as a building block to creating a coherent worldview that everyone can eventually benefit from. Benefits aren't always instant, and almost always aren't when actually worthwhile. So while it could seem not beneficial at first, I'd recommend you widen your scope and reassess. It isn't initially beneficial to learn the complexities of a musical instrument, but the reward comes later when you can perform fluidly without restraint. There's good across time, and there's good in the moment. This is actually what sin, quote unquote, to miss the mark, to error, represents. The need for instant gratification, regardless of cost. Many decisions of self-gratification ultimately become self-destruction. Scale to society becomes the destruction, or rather deconstruction, the breakdown of that society. In part, the breakdown in dialogue between the political left versus right paradigm comes down to an issue of linguistics and philosophy more than morality, although it can be that as well. Often it's not one party cares for one and another doesn't. It's that one side, the conservatives, are generally more conscientious, therefore the timeline is significantly longer to establish care. Whereas many of our left-leaning countrymen want to establish care instantly, as they are more agreeable. Sometimes instant care is needed, but many a time it is counterproductive to the long-term needs of the individual, and therefore the civilization. Instant versus longevity, conserve versus expand, safeguard versus liberate are all necessary debates. We've arrived at the endgame, and time isn't on our side anymore. What I hope to clear up in this paper is why the need to look at both the individual and collective is critical, and how to rescue Western civilization from totalitarianism beyond anything that has been possible in the past. Natural law. For the sake of objectivity, I'll be referring to God as the highest possible good and the height of awareness, i.e., the alpha, beginning, and the omega, end, of consciousness and creation. My cosmogony is based on how I see coherence in the metaphysics, nature of reality, with epistemology, true or false, and ethics, right or wrong. It's not belief we need to change, but behavior. Of course, often one precedes the other, hence the necessity for justification. But it's not an ultimatum. People with the quote right unquote beliefs can act abhorrently, and people with the quote wrong unquote ones can act like saints, i.e., you'll know them by their fruits, Jesus Christ said in Matthew 7:16. Behavior is what alters objective reality. As Jane Austen said, it isn't what we say or think that defines us, but what we do. While our subjective experience is often foundational to our behavior, it isn't mandatory to have a certain belief to act accordingly, as natural law is written on the human heart. And there we go to the book of Romans. The founding fathers certainly did not pursue a religious state, and I'm not advocating to do so either. I know no one, myself especially, who understands enough about the mechanics of the human condition to justify such a thing. Instead, to look at it philosophically, at first principles. We can't know for sure the origins, but we can know what's better or worse. The founders did, however, pursue a nation governed by a higher order than man, and appreciated the philosophical presupposition Christ offered the world. All men and women have sovereignty under God, whatever their lot in life, be they a prostitute or a king, and deserve justice, i.e., don't bear false witness, and you're innocent until proven guilty. All men and women deserve freedom from usury and tyranny by vice. Suffice it to say, we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater with any tools from our toolbox of truth. Many presidents throughout America's history understood that freedom cannot exist in a vacuum. Only combined with responsibility, a response ability, can it truly flourish for more than a generation or so. This obviously doesn't mean we can't have fun in life. It just means fun can only exist, just like freedom can only exist long term, if we have discipline the majority of the time before and after, a fact that is present in the life of every individual as well. We need to be honest about how our ethics are grounded and how they are replicated from micro to macro to ensure our freedom is sustainable and our sovereignty attainable. Our civilization must be built on a rock, not sand. That rock is the highest possible good. My philosophy. Free will is the human story, which means it can always be a choice between truth or deception, and love or fear. My philosophy is predicated on the individual's conscious intent as the bedrock of one's experience. I don't think we own the forces of right or wrong. They merely flow through us like data composites absorbed from our experience, just as logic or illogic does. But we do in fact own our choices which bind us to them. Your choices are indeed the most valuable asset to your being, or your biggest enemy. You may not own the energetic source of it, but you definitively own the behavior which stems from the choice, be it greatness or wickedness. The more we align with that which is true, the more we can act with love, and the more we can change the world for the better, indefinitely. Don't be afraid. The best is yet to come, if we seize it. I hope to see America declare non-dependence and leave all global governance initiatives to seize its own destiny for the 21st century. Defining abstracts. This isn't the totality of sequences of each philosophical branch, e.g. first-order logic, parentheses laws of logic, could really be classified as metaphysics. It's discovered, not created, and as mathematics it precedes physics, as would geometry. It must therefore precede epistemology, as learning at all in any coherent fashion requires you to presuppose logic to make sense of thoughts. Instead of an exhaustive list, this is how I class the core tenets of philosophical principles to my philosophy, as they relate to this work and the current condition we find ourselves in. I'm making the case in metaphysics that cosmology and consciousness, or cosmogony and spirit, would also precede ontology and are inherently linked to our sense of identity and sovereignty. We see good and evil in behavior, hence why it's the layer above ethics, but while the case can't be made empirically, one could rationally make the case that it precedes ontology as well. Parentheses, an argument for another time. Philosophy, in sequence. Metaphysics, nature of reality. Ontology, nature of humanity. Epistemology, source of knowledge. Rationality, understanding information. Empiricism, observation. Ethics, good versus evil. Behavior, right versus wrong. Sovereignty, i.e. nationism and freedom, begins at a significantly earlier level of the abstract, in the ontology, nature of humanity. Technocracy, i.e. global governance, only begins at the latter stages of the abstract, empiricism and behavior. The use of linguistics as a tool of social engineering is not new, but ancient. Of course, the legal system is largely built upon the public not being able to properly comprehend statutes. Similarly, marketing supposes the void one feels inside can be filled through reflecting subtle desires via grossly hyperbolic language to their target audience. By reflecting what the public want to see and simultaneously being clear with their intent, the technocrats have the capability of achieving their goals while remaining in honor from a legalese perspective. I'm making the case here that a true understanding of the linguistics, both that which I use and that which they use, will make way for a true understanding of the intentions. What the public may think or feel is often vastly different to the original message. Linguistics. Global governance. Notice it is not government, but governance. This is because governance can include non-elected representatives, such as, but not limited to, corporate stakeholders, as outlined in Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030, as well as the Great Reset. As global governance becomes more apparent and openly aligned with technocracy, expect appointed experts in once democratic leadership roles. It is critical to understand that global governance is not going to result in sovereign government, nations, or individuals. It is the antithesis of all. Sustainable development. Public perception is that sustainable development is about recycling, taking care of the environment and being responsible with consumption, when those, if we are lucky, would be mere byproducts of it. Notice, sustainable development is never extrapolated to its result for the public to make a decision, because it is a PR term for global governance, and, quote, sustainable, unquote, means everything you do on a daily basis must go to, quote, save the planet, unquote. Page 350 of the UN's Global Biodiversity Assessment Report states livestock, including cows, sheep, goats, and horses, is not sustainable. So there goes farmland, organic food, and necessary protein for healthy humans. The Biodiversity Treaty, presented to world leaders and being implemented in America now, is a transformation into centralized control of food production, property, housing and land, medical and social care, energy, water, every aspect of our lives. Globalists. Global citizens, those people, most often with left-leaning political views, that favor global governance over sovereignty, national or individual. Although they don't serve leftists that hold classically left views, parentheses, corporate accountability in support of the working class, globalists appear on conservative sides too, but are not actually aligning with conservatism on core tenets, so they will, for the sake of convenience, be classed as globalist here. Sovereignty. Principal boundaries from individual to collective and a result of natural law acted out. Throughout history, it had developed from tribe to nation to empire, but began to become more universally franchised in and after the classical Greece period, BC, with the focus mostly on men, and arguably became universal in principle and instruction, i.e. to the individual, for the first time with the figure of Christ. 17th century English liberalism saw this become a cultural political reality, leading to inspire the Founding Fathers' philosophy a century later. Sovereignty requires conscious consent from the recipient, and I'd argue also requires the individual to be conscious of themselves in the same fashion, as well as of others, to remain sovereign. Nationism, a term I may have coined. Nationism is more synonymous with patriotism than nationalism, though more specific than both. Nationism means sovereignty is both individual and collective. While this can involve a people, either by ethnicity, birth, or religion, it often relays the values of the individuals of that nation en masse. I hold it highly as I see it as necessary to keeping individuals sovereign at all, as a collective of those under the same suppositional umbrella can maintain shared principles reciprocally. It also acts as a major deterrent to global governance. Nationism holds sovereignty of the nation-state to being a naturally occurring preference and necessity, particularly in the 2010s, where it became more apparently threatened by varying forms of supranational organizations, be it the United Nations, including WHO, or the European Union. Technocracy denotes the science of social engineering, a means of governance birthed around 100 years ago, but not becoming prevalent until the 21st century. This system of governance is the modus operandi of global governance, if not always by name, by attributes. In a technocracy, economics, science, technology, and politics all become one system, where, quote, experts, unquote, dictate policy and cultural shifts, instead of the public and voters. Natural law, the golden rule. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Jesus Christ, Matthew 7:12. We see this idea appearing earliest potentially in Confucius's philosophical writing, but it appears in all major religions: Buddhism, Islam, of course Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Taoism, and more. This is a fundamental rule of natural law. I'd argue something every human being is aware of, whether they respect or pay attention to it or not. While mankind has struggled throughout history to maintain order and freedom simultaneously, the Bill of Rights offered the pinnacle of both at the time of its creation, due to natural law, rights endowed by our Creator being at its center, and a sovereign population with the agency to defend it. Miscellaneous definitions. Proof. Evidence or argument establishing or helping to establish a fact or the truth of a statement. Interpreted as concluded without question. Evidence. The available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. Interpretation. Concluded based on a collection of answered questions. Kill. Cause the death of a person or living being. Interpretation. Can be done in defense or as a byproduct of careless action and hubris. Murder. The premeditated killing of a human being. Interpretation. Conscious intent to end one's life regardless of threat level. Truth. That which is true or in accordance with fact or reality. Interpretation. Truth, including claims, must be objective in addition to subjective if it's to be claimed at all. Love. Intense deep affection, including gratitude and compassion. Interpretation. Love isn't allowing everything one requests. It's acting with love despite the circumstance and response. 1. Origin of the global governance problem. When considering the question, should governance be global or national, historical arguments have often been lacking in objective evidence for either side. The majority of reasoning throughout the debate has been standing on an Enlightenment-era platform of empiricism versus a contemporary platform of idealism, the former being the world we see through 5 sense observation, and the latter, the world we see through better values. The problem with something existing across time, e.g. land ownership, is it requires a superseding authority to even ensure there's anything for anyone to rightfully own at all. If we are not grounded in an absolute, we're merely arguing over preferences, which can only be resolved in one side winning through brute force or total subversion. And if it were to come to that regardless, you'd want to be on the side that is able to justify itself. If we are to avoid catastrophe, we must remember the presuppositions that held society together among plagues and war. That is our justification for the truth of human nature and validity of moral action. Quote from the Technocrat, 1938. Technocracy is the science of social engineering, the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population. Ironically, atheists of days gone by were the anti-idealists, especially in the birth of naive empiricism, and the idealists were liberals and often Christian, such as the anti-slavery campaigners in England like John Locke. Today, we see atheists being idealists and, quote, liberals, unquote, while conservatives often make a more empirical case. As these political definitions in origin no longer match reality, we need to reclarify the terms as they are visible today. Atheist liberals today, at least those that represent the side of global governance and its aims, are utopians but actually anti-liberal, as linguistics fail us due to the axiology of both liberals and conservatives changing dramatically over time. They no longer behave like the original definitions of their political identity because they no longer value the same outcome. Liberals from the English Enlightenment tradition would have also been more conservative than today's conservatives, and the conservatives of today that are akin to those of the past being considered authoritarian and even fascist. What we really have in America today is English liberalism, emphasizing individualism and posing as conservatism, with an opposition that is French social liberalism. Radical socialists, opportunist Republicans, socialists. Posing as liberalism and emphasizing the collective's diktats. We usually see the data paraded around about how immigrants are good for the economy, or oppositely, how immigrants take away jobs from natives, when both of these points of view rely on the subjectivity and preferences of the reader. If side A wins and side B loses, or vice versa, isn't that just the luck or lack thereof of life? Isn't that just human history of war and conquest? Why should anyone even win at all? What exactly is winning? After all, modern atheist liberals will argue that globalism reduces suffering in the aggregate of the population at large, and conservatives say the same about the free market. Therefore, their opinions have more validity based on raw data. That may be true, subjectively, and subjectively one can make a reverse case, which is exactly the reason I wouldn't make that case. Instead, I'll break down the ideology of those that favor global governance. Define suffering. If suffering is ultimately those that feel some kind of pain, be it emotional or physical, then how do you prioritize which suffering is worse? Is someone who suffers with an extreme form of schizophrenia in middle America, isolated and alone with no social support, but with unemployment money, suffering less than someone who has full mental faculty and a loving family but little money in India? If suffering is merely a material process of entropy, is it not just a byproduct of the, quote, accidental, unquote, nature of a chaotic universe at work? Why exactly should one care about suffering to begin with in a materialist paradigm? It is only the suffering that benefits their outcome that they are interested in. Too many times, hypocrisy has been shouted from the side of all those that oppose modern leftism, not understanding that it isn't hypocrisy at all. It is about what gains you power. One shouldn't assume that the enemy is playing the same game as them. You may think you're playing poker with a fair side, not knowing that they have the cards counted in advance or a camera behind your back. You can also hear often, why don't they care about the working class anymore while opposing the rich? And why do they care about one race more than another while opposing racism? Proclaimed by conservatives. But again, this misses the point, which is that they only care about the struggles that advance their agenda. If it moves the dial a notch further towards global governance, you can expect many in positions of political and corporate power to support that cause, whether they've historically done so or not, or whether it seems antithetical to their values and even profit margins or not. If it does not equal a reduction of sovereignty and move towards global governance, they will not support it, whether it fits leftism or not, and in some cases whether it fits conservatism or not. It is not utilitarianism alone that globalists are interested in. It's a utilitarianism that favors their specified goals. If they were not biased on suffering, and their ambition truly was to cultivate a more formidable world regardless of, quote, feelings, unquote, and, quote, sentiments, unquote, e.g., trust the science and don't believe in fairy tales, then is it not more practical and intellectually consistent to focus on the strong, those who can build society up rather than those who do nothing but drain its resources? Especially if those resources or the misuse of them are going to bring about inevitable doom in the form of climate catastrophe. Which brings me to the above layer of reducing suffering as a modus operandi. The issue that drives the political ideology of a one-world state model is not ultimately economic or migration, but climate change, and in some cases COVID-19 is the prerequisite that, quote, requires global governance. What we are sacrificing is liberty for security then, and eventually will have neither, as Benjamin Franklin famously noted. As climate change is the longest reigning antagonist in the narrative, I'll be referring to it throughout this paper as opposed to the COVID-19 response, which I just view as a bridge between the pre-lockdown world to the post-technocratic one. There are many thousands of threads that tie together this global governance worldview with a political or private organization, but for the sake of brevity, I'd like to focus solely on its catalyst, Agenda 21, and later 2030, for its origin. Reject global governance. Don't reject environmentalism. Notice the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism, not including leaders chosen by the people, completely bypassing the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Are we really going to lose our choice of representation indefinitely to save some trees? Although I'm making the case we should be rejecting any UN initiatives that offer, quote, environmental, unquote, protocols, that is because those protocols are wrapped in global governance, which threaten America's way of life beyond reproach. Mandates elevating attention to the environment could be sovereign, asked for directly from voters to their elected representatives, who take it to the state and in some cases national level. Adapting needs with changing circumstances is part of our political evolution. That should not be an open invitation for technocratic vultures to pick apart a caucus like a corpse. I happen to think it's a valiant effort on the part of those that genuinely care about Mother Earth and want to conserve her for future generations. If climate change was not suffocated by global governance, i.e., it was independent from all the other political affiliations it is affiliated with, I've no doubt environmentalists could make significantly more progress. However, if your wish is to reduce or stop deforestation, which I could agree with, but simultaneously I'm also forced via government coercion and the threat of force to agree to several other morally deficit policies, the answer of course is going to be a no, unless I or anyone else was willing to lose all self-respect. How could it ever not be a no? Consider this. Your party has an environmental program which it wants to pursue post-election, but the manifesto also approves of late-term abortion, illegal immigration in sanctuary cities, and more foreign war intervention. Do you really expect to be able to meet in the middle? That political affiliation, of course, expedites division much further when environmentalism is exclusive with global governance, i.e., non-elected experts that openly want to discard the Constitution and our way of life. Freedom is not freedom from consequences. I think I've made the case it is actually the opposite. Freedom can only exist with an understanding of consequences, meaning that the environment, our land, our agriculture, our wildlife must be included. Heavy tolls should be paid for those that can't be responsible enough not to avoid throwing a cigarette into a dry woodland or those dumping into the ocean and lakes. Looking after our soil by avoiding and restricting any toxic use, especially those from corporate conglomerates, i.e. Monsanto and the like, keeping our water clean, keeping our nature green, and our animals pristine shouldn't be a point of contention for patriots, left or right. What is the major point of contention, and one that we can never, never, never concede on, is allowing global governance to fully manifest to do this work on our behalf, at the expense of losing God-given rights for man-made privileges. Agenda 21. Maurice Strong, 1992. The United Nations Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro was the launch of the publicly available document Agenda 21, which is the agenda for the 21st century, as dictated by an oligarchy of intergovernmental bureaucrats and private interests, i.e. technocrats. Maurice Strong was also a member of the Club of Rome, which detailed out world-changing plans as early as the 1970s for, quote, saving the planet, unquote. Incidentally, when climate alarmism began arising with foo data models and predictions that never happened, with plenty of cited contrary evidence that it still isn't happening. Agenda 21 and its latter milestone goals of Agenda 2030 are official, though, ratified in various guises and obscure policy names in many regions across America and the world already. Agenda 21 lays the ground for the political framework of a new age of governance, which is the end of elected representatives, especially nationally, and the heralding in of civil partnerships, a state-to-local level initiative of politicians and corporate shareholders. This already exists, and they are doing so without sufficient scientific proof of their reason. Where it eventually goes, projected by the UN for 2030 and beyond, is to corporate stakeholders and appointed representatives, quote, the experts, unquote, to run things. Klaus Schwab has decided to call this the Great Reset, hence his ideas of stakeholder capitalism, but really it is just Agenda 21 and 2030 rebranded. Its reach is deep within most local regions across America and across the planet. This is a regionalized plan that links global corporate and government stakeholders, i.e. the UN and World Economic Forum, to localized stakeholders, i.e. NGOs and business, fulfilling the goals set out by Agenda 21 and 2030. Regionalization means global to local systems, bypassing the nation-state, as well as most rights upheld by a nation-state, including the Bill of Rights and Constitution. Here are the key takeaways to learn from what global governance really means, if implemented fully. The end of national sovereignty, the end of private property rights, the end of privacy, the end of free enterprise and cash, the end of gun rights and adequate self-defense, means and laws. Agenda 21 means one thing: the control of all resources on the planet, and is said so explicitly in its documentation for the, quote, good of the planet, unquote, of course. The centralization of power in all key areas of life: land, water, and air. This equates to just about everything human beings walk and live on, eat and drink from, travel on and through. It is the total control of you. The mechanics of this will be done via technology and policies of the so-called experts. Smart everything, to the finest details of one's life. Welcome to 2030. Welcome to the smart city, the panopticon of the future, where you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. For global governance, the outcome, to work, there's a prerequisite of a totalitarian system to ensure it. That is technocracy, which requires the correct tools, in this case, smart cities. Smart everything. Agenda 21 is the political framework. Technocracy is the governance framework. Sustainable development is the public relations framework. And global governance is the implemented framework. Technocracy, the ideology of the science of social engineering, began in the 1920s to bring about the end of capitalism versus communism by essentially bridging the two worst parts of both systems together. Technocracy, then, is the mechanics of how global governance comes to be a reality. The former is the method, the latter is the outcome, which is why they are used synonymously in this letter. It is not exaggerative to say that even if this is 50% correct, our lives would be impacted beyond measure, far more even than our founding fathers were by the British Empire. This would be the end of the constitutional republic and indeed human 1.0 life, but not via military invasion, silently, via creeping legislation happening now, and economic hollowing out dictated by organizations and people you don't vote for, but are operating in your town anyway. If it seems impossible, consider how different a world it was in January 2020 compared to the summer of 2021. Consider how tech companies and even banks such as Wells Fargo or PayPal can withdraw you from platforms and from accessing your own money by operating with their own terms and conditions instead of under a sovereign declaration like the Bill of Rights. Could that not be expanded into other sectors? If it can affect your money already, it can very easily affect your property too, and indeed it must for this to come to pass. Consider how pervasive the climate change narrative is, how widespread and ever-present it is. Consider the lengths they go to, all cited in the paper on the website, and the resources they have to demonstrate what these organizations are capable of. This is what global governance is, how it operates, and why. This is America's ultimate antagonist, at least as a political destiny. This, the foe that is responsible for the dramatic reduction in sovereignty and freedom, an enemy far more insidious, resourceful, and innately mendacious than King George III, who is at least honest about his oppressive intentions during America's birth. How would one go about defeating an enemy they didn't see attacking them? First, we must know thy enemy. Then, we would need a redeclaration of independence for the 21st century, or rather, be self-sufficient enough to declare non-dependence on their systems and withdraw our consent, reclaiming our own political destiny. 2. The worldview underpinning totalitarianism. Understanding the psychology of technocrats and the worldview leading to global governance is fundamental to understanding how we arrived here. You cannot oppose that which you do not understand, and they operate under the radar with the result, but openly with the intention, due to the effective use of linguistics and cherry-picked data highlighted. Quote, Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. To really understand technocracy, which is totalitarianism in any meaningful sense of the definition, we must understand the philosophy underpinning it. Western civilization did not slide into decline because of an increase in taxes here and there, disagreements about trade unions, or a difference in priorities. Those issues have always existed. The decline has transpired to the why beneath. The purpose for those positions have lost their original value. We may disagree on the degree to which social services should be funded, but we at least initially equally cared about achieving the same result, which is a safety and a prosperity for our nation and people, and eventually the world. The exchange of the value of those who once cared about trade unions, for example, into climate change, is just one of many to explain the worldview shifts in culture. Nowadays, an increase in taxes often means funneling cash into climate change protocols or identity politics initiatives, mutually exclusive, as opposed to replenishing the dwindling income of the working class. Hence, the deeper division now compared to decades past. This is why the political division now often seems more personal than it used to, because the globalists are already operating in our nations, plural, So we're not just facing an external enemy beyond our borders, but one within our borders that has many influential levers of political, economic, educational, and cultural control. This is why Trump or Brexit was as much a revolt against the internal corridors of control as it was the external. This isn't necessarily an endorsement of all the policies or qualities of an anti-globalist personal movement, but a correct diagnosis of the worldview clash we're witnessing. It's not left versus right, or liberal versus conservative anymore, as much as it is sovereigntist versus globalist. A technocrat must assume a position above any authority to be the authority. The justification for micromanaging individual lives, to the point of hellish tyranny, could only be possible in materialist utilitarianism, a cult, or a warped pseudo-religious paradigm. We're not dealing with the latter, albeit strangely similar in resonance with just replacing the god. But we are dealing with a materialist cult, one that assumes all you need is the baseline needs they have said you need. To presume that one only needs basic needs to be fulfilled in life is a major part of the worldview clash here. The presupposition from them that man's nature is one of survival alone and not one of also looking to the transcendent. The mantra of technocrats, if honest, would be something like, you don't need freedom, you don't need autonomy, you certainly don't need God, you just need us to dictate to you, and we'll ensure there'll be plenty of GMO food and social credits to at least not perish, because we're very compassionate. To assume the position of authority by providing you with things nature already provides you with is the epitome of all totalitarian regimes in history. The oligarchs of this neo-feudalism are essentially picking your own wallet and selling it back to you at full price, plus interest. This worldview is one of the earliest narratives of human legend from various traditions, but especially personified in Christianity with Lucifer, which is the desire that man be his own god. This isn't supposed to represent a person losing their free will, their individuality or conscience. On the contrary, a coherent worldview would only be supported by your conscience. Their worldview is about narcissistic pride. Hubris is the baseline for all, quote, sin, unquote, because it removes humility from the equation, which is the need for respect, listening, and consent. Humility is the foundation of all learning and growth. The fool is the precursor to the savior, said Carl Jung. And if one believes they have all the answers, or worse, they are the answer, there's no limit to the crimes they could commit. In this case, the technocratic gods have withdrawn respect from the unwashed masses, abundantly the working class of the West, and have absolved themselves of the respect for the laws of nature in favor of their own utopian vision of what your life should be. Just like communism or fascism before it, technocracy and global governance cares very little about the vulnerable populations they create and then kill to achieve their nationless, libertyless, godless utopia. One nation under God versus integrity, professionalism, and respect for diversity. Are human beings merely cogs in a machine that keep the world turning? In which case, a global governance utilitarian political philosophy would indeed be more pragmatic should your end goal be to centralize decision-making for efficiency. If, however, human nature is indeed geared towards the transcendent, then we must build society around that core principle and not the other way around. Utilitarianism isn't bad by nature. On the contrary, I find paying attention to the usefulness of activity and objects very useful. As a fundamental philosophy, though, it's a dead end. Lacking in a transcendent goal renders it, ironically, useless across time. Placing a utilitarian frame over a transcendent one allows for the combination of a philosophy that spans through the immediate needs effectively, utility, and to the long-term needs effectively, transcendence, so we arrive at a cohesive destination to build upon. I don't see how the answers can be found solely in the globalist universal utilitarian school of thought, when one needs to align every layer of being to be fulfilled. Efficiency is hardly enough to sustain one through trauma and loss, nor is it sufficient in quelling pain and propelling one's transcendent need to be heroic in their own life. Efficiency and effectiveness as survival strategies are dependent upon what lies underneath them. For their own sake, they're nothing but temporary band-aids to our psyche at best, and an excuse for total human control of behavior at worst. How has this question, roughly, does man have any meaning, come to be, and why has it pervaded public consciousness in the 21st century? Referring back to the opposing forces in question, we can look at the self-professed principles of both camps for a more accurate presuppositional platform to reason on. America, one nation under God. United Nations, integrity, professionalism, and respect for diversity. Which of these values has more depth? The United Nations principles on the surface have more specificity, therefore apparent value against our broad American principles. But is that really the case? How does respect for diversity tell me how to act towards my wife and children over the course of their lives? Is integrity even possible without a transcendent value? And if so, how would one measure it? Is professionalism going to hasten strength against the tragedies of life, with God representing the highest good, that which we value most across time? For example, individual sovereignty, which inherently represents no murder, theft, adultery, etc., and being truthful. We have a consistent anchor that can assimilate into every layer of society, individual to collective, while representing and respecting the needs and boundaries of both. The reason there is no anchor with the United Nations is because the goalposts are supposed to be adaptable to the needs of technocrats. They are not supposed to be inherent because they are not ontological. If you place yourself in the position of God, I would guess you could rationalize any principles, even if they are inconsistent with each other over time. The necessity for a proper hierarchy, God at the top, followed by family, then community, then nation, is what made America the greatest nation on earth. Only by aiming for the highest point will you even get halfway to it. God being at the top of the hierarchy also ensures that man can't assume the position of God, consequently the position of dictator. If the collective goal is economic or social alone, you'll fail due to the presupposition being that survival, such as finances or a lack of anxiety in social settings, will fulfill a human being. I'm yet to see any credible evidence for such a supposition. Indeed, only through aiming above economic or social needs could you even properly fulfill the promises of those needs to begin with. Would your relationships work better if you were trying to please those people in the moment? Or would they work better if you were improving yourself to the point that those people could rely on you when they need you? I.e., are your relationships more fruitful if you're useful to them short-term or long-term? Fruitfulness is dependent upon the quality of the tree and the conditions that keep the tree alive. It's not the tree nor the fruits alone that bear sustenance, but both, combined with the elements and harmony of sunlight, rain, wind, and wildlife, which all help it grow, despite on the surface seeming competitive. Likewise, as living men and women, our values, the tree, can only be as good as our actions, the fruit, which both require being rooted in a stable good, the earth, and aiming towards the transcendent, the elements. Living in the present, in addition to working with higher order values, thinking and action, is not unlike being a fruitful tree in harmony with nature. Difficult as it may be, you must aim high and be present, as well as for each other, which offers every member of society to have their time and place of significance, and each eventually complete one another. Sovereignty of the collective is predicated on the sovereignty of the individual, and vice versa. Quote Jesus Christ, Matthew 19:30. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. 3. Current state of the states. Just as despotism adores a moral vacuum to take further political and economic control from a posterity, a requirement is also a lack of citizen responsibility. Both cultural immorality, en masse error, and personal irresponsibility, not paying attention, are the foundational breeding ground for tyranny. Indeed, tyranny can become wished for by even some of the more moral men when a society becomes degenerate enough. Did these United States lose sovereignty of their money, laws and borders vis-a-vis invasion or dictatorship? No. They are slipping away due to the mental gymnastics one plays in their personal life through justifying the gutting out of the economy by corporate stakeholders and domestic violence from the state. Would you stand idly by as a drunken narcissist in an expensive business suit insulted your wife because he felt he'd get away with it? If yes, then you have more pressing issues to attend to than even this one. If no, then why are you allowing it for yourself and your nation and your children's future? Surely the latter is of the utmost importance to any man who still has a will to live. Have you no self-respect left at all? Quote St. Thomas Aquinas. Hereafter, the rule of law requires the prince or state to act in accordance with the law. The purpose of government is therefore moral because of its originator, God. I assume with a fair amount of confidence that if you're still reading this, then you're not likely the individual above. That being said, all of us, I think, have been far from courageous in standing up to immorality at some point, despondent, giving up, unable to see the light at the end of the tunnel, or the purpose in the fight. Yeah. It's almost a rite of passage. Now, assuming we care enough about these United States, one must look at the current structure in place to properly confront it before, as it has been doing, grows like an aggressive cancer that can no longer be stopped without amputating all the good parts of the body with it. Noting these versus the United States. Initially, America, the nation, was made up of states that became united. It wasn't intended that the United States would become the primary identity. It was a sovereign homeland of America with autonomous states comprising its united constitution. I also speak of these in a return to the founders' vision, because states' rights have become more valuable than any time since the Civil War, perhaps any time in history, should global governance come to pass in entirety. There are several reasons as to why America has undergone such a dramatic change, and how sovereignty has been weakened almost to the point of no return. Again, if sovereignty is an ontological value, that is, an inherent gift from our Creator which can only be transgressed in immorality, then we also have to be realistic about how sovereignty is reciprocally upheld and why. It is, of course, dependent upon shared values, specifically the highest value. In the case of America and Western civilization, that is something akin to the Christian moral framework with a liberal mediator, i.e. Christianity for the people, and a traditional liberalism for the state. I prefer to look at it as an historical, Christ-like meta-narrative, with empirically liberal day-to-day agreements, which is doing to others what you expect done to you and for you. It is then the state's job to ensure no one is transgressing against their neighbor in any way they can't defend themselves, or the population isn't being stolen from by corporations and banks. But it is the job of citizenry to ensure the underlying ethics are not transgressed in their household, community, and ultimately nation. How has sovereignty been lost? And why did America lose ground to globalism without a bullet being fired? There are many differing types of warfare, and it need not involve guns and tanks most of the time. As we discussed, weakening the resolve of your target is far more effective than fighting one with conviction. If you are to hijack a constitutional republic and more globally hijack its counterpart democracy, you must use that very system to weaken their faith in it. Consider mass immigration and voting rights. We know the data is clear on how most immigrants and recent descendants in America vote, which is at least 70%, sometimes 80% Democrat. As an immigrant myself, I'm aware of the irony, but it's not about me and it's not about them. It's about the truth, and it's about opposing the dystopian future of global governance. And to do so thoroughly, we must look at the mechanics of our current situation. It's not a value judgment on those people either. It's just an obvious clash of worldview. But when the Second Amendment is exclusively an American phenomenon, is it really any wonder why outsiders becoming insiders don't value it as highly as, say, economics? Who can blame them, really? That's what most of the world knows, correct? So, as your previously held rights are no longer considered rights with increasing democratic franchise, you need to understand part of that issue is due to the value hierarchy in which different groups operate within. When states then flip politically and centuries held rights diminish, it's not due to tyranny, but due to democracy. And you're not anti-democracy, are you? Of course, we're not bystanding to tyranny or blaming everyone for their views. However, the reality is much of the tyranny is via democracy, and that's because they're using the very tool they want to remove, elected government, to remove itself. Just as global governance clearly states that it is not an elected national government agenda for the future, likewise they aren't snatching up gun rights without expressing so to their base first, many a time. It is crucial at this juncture to embellish that the Founding Fathers' vision was not a democracy anyway, but a constitutional republic, where the core tenets of natural law could never be altered by votes. Usurping America's interests via free market economics. Free trade economics has also been used ad nauseum to usurp America's sovereignty by creating a dependency on the financial ruling class for wealth generation as well as foreign goods and services, i.e. global capitalism, to get by. The former is not what we used to see as the free market, that is the free exchange of goods and services between consenting parties, as it has morphed into a protected system with rules unto itself. Consider the tech companies in California, Facebook, Apple, and Google. Is it constitutional to be able to fire American citizens for their peaceful expression of religious or political views, or in fact, banning millions from the platforms altogether for the same reason? What kind of free market isn't free? In any civilized age, no free market gets to operate outside of the supreme law of the land. That's not a free market, that's feudalism. Rules for thee, but not for me, and the opposite of natural law. This typical logical insanity has a purpose for them, though, which is to culturally gerrymander the appropriate support and amplify those views which, again, lead to global governance. Know the outcome, and you'll see the journey. If we are to properly decode their intentions with supposed biases, we need only translate whichever political platitude they're shouting into global governance, and it'll make logical sense by aligning their actions to their worldview. This is a dependency because Google knows it can't have a competitor. It therefore gets to usurp American sovereignty and sell her freedom to the highest bidder, all while utilizing their conservative enemies' platform of free market and private company to escape retribution for their crimes of breaking constitutional law. No organization nor individual should ever be above the supreme law of the land. Just as the king would kneel to Christ, as would the plumber, so must a tech company concede to the Constitution, as must a convenience store. Currently, this free market is usurping Amendments 1, 4, and indirectly, via global governance, 10. Usurping the internal economy via cheap imports of goods and services from external sources, be they China, most problematic, or South America, has also laid waste to the production ability of the native population, consequently weakening America's sovereignty. If you weaken the individuals in your flock, as we've explored already, you weaken the whole, and vice versa. Diminishing livelihoods of Americans has perhaps been the most long-standing of these, as it has, over time, made each of us, understandably so, more desperate for whatever scraps we can be thrown by the ruling class. Self-sufficiency, as we'll come to, is critical to retain sovereignty. Early America utilized tariffs instead of taxes for a very good reason. The former protects internal industry while providing additional income for the state, while the latter provides power to external actors and weakens income internally. If one is to rely on China, for example, then a nation can never be sovereign, not even with all the guns and laws permitting it. Protecting America's real interests, i.e., love thy neighbor as thyself, is not negotiable if we are to reclaim America's non-dependence, therefore sovereignty, thus freedom. Free markets are only valuable if natural law, especially within the confines of our nation, is not being defiled. Local, non-elected organizations spearheading global governance. The enemy is within our gates could be no better exemplified than via our regional systems of governance. Referring back to the notion that we're not fighting an only external enemy in these times, but also one internally posing as our side while transferring the power from elected to non-elected and from national to global. The logical end of that trajectory is to make the nation-state redundant entirely, having only regional control at the behest of the global. To make matters worse, most don't understand who the enemy is. It's not a king, but it is an empire, the biggest and most silent the world has ever known. The enemy is neither an army or specific politician, and although global governance is certainly furthered under Democratic constituencies, it's not exclusive. Many Republican states are under the same UN initiatives, not least Texas, Arizona, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, albeit to a lesser degree than the very blue West Coast, Midwest, and East Coast. So who are these organizations? What do they do? And why should you care? Primarily, the impetus for this being global to local is America, and indeed the nations of the world, are to be divided into regions for sustainability, relinquishing the majority of land to the state, technocrats, to be managed and forcing populations to live in human settlement zones. Human settlement zones in true Hunger Games style aesthetic will be the overall area we're supposed to live in, nestled inside the mega regions, pictured in map on the paper on the website, that will also be comprising of the zone's business and regulated land use, with smart cities mentioned being the engine, the city of the region. Global governance is technocracy, is sustainable development. These terms are interchangeable. Their outcome is equivalent. They have already been destroying family farms for years and funding global governance, i.e. a one-world state, with your tax dollars by simply labeling it sustainable development. That's how easy it has been to subvert our beautiful country without a single shot fired, by stealing our money through an unelected network off the back of climate change. You didn't vote for this, of course, but you're getting it nonetheless. And the corporate stakeholders funding it are doing so knowingly and reciprocally, unlike you. The stakeholders will receive dividends by being the only groups allowed to operate under the very stringent sustainable development legislation. This is technocracy at work, and it's just at its birth. To repeal this UN framework, we will have to do so with all hands on deck, state by state, region by region, and even city by city. A mammoth task, but it is achievable. It is time to take back control of our political system, to request with vigor and passion that your City Hall representatives and even congressmen work with you to reject these United Nations mandates. The people still currently have the control of the legislature should they wish to seize it, and God has ordained man with free will, i.e. sovereignty, without charge and without limit. To fully paint the picture here, global governance is the new empire, and one that is far more formidable than King George III could have ever been. It is an empire built on neo-feudal economics, where only a powerful elite get to have access to the full extent of the free market, and a techno-communist means of implementation for the rest of us, where no one's rights are inherent, but granted at the will of the few that hold the levers of decision-making. If you've had your eyes open throughout the COVID-19 response, the tyrannical government protocols, tracking, tracing, shutting down independent business while keeping open corporations, and the free market businesses enforcing their own restrictions against the supreme law of the land due to terms and conditions, you'll already see the process is underway. What these localized global governance protocols do on a meta level is, ironically, ensure the sustainability of that system, but the unsustainability of our more natural system, as it becomes a more fully functional technocracy in the lead up to 2030. This would mean we lose our land for agriculture when food production equals sovereignty. We'd lose rural economies and living to smart city enforced business and housing regulations when rural living equals community autonomy. And we'd lose constitutional rights as these regions operate under climate change mandates, i.e. the UN's Agenda 21 platform supersedes our American one. If this seems impossible, just consider how EU law supersedes that of nations in Europe and how much global governance is entrenched in every political layer in America already. Self-sufficiency is key to freedom. Exploring the fundamental argument I'm making in this paper, that is, the philosophy of non-dependence, and why, as controversial as it is in the current paradigm of globalism, it is necessary for the continuation of America as a nation and people, we should look at self-sufficiency fundamentals. One could make the case that global governance could also result in a lack of national sovereignty, but further individual sovereignty, ergo, be in accordance with natural law. But that is empirically false with the past, present, and future protocols documented and in action. As the scale increases, so too does the lack of representation, and consequently, the respect for the voice of the individual. One need not look any further than to see if the individual rights of Europeans have been more heard under their nation or under the European Union. Does Washington, D.C., know what is good for the South Dakota farmer? Not often. So scale that out further to the United Nations or subsidiary organization of, and you'll find it gets worse, more separated, more arbitrary, more incohesive, and far more likely to result in totalitarianism and death. America was the greatest nation on earth because of the combination of conscientious people who valued freedom. Again, I stress it's not the need to drop enjoyment and vocation from our lives. This should be obvious, but the need for balance, to take care of the fundamentals so we can be free-spirited where it counts. It's not about working makes us free, hence we just need to continue putting in more hours. It's about not ceding that, which we require to survive and prosper, so we don't have to sacrifice our principles later due to dependency on foreign actors. If we have lost the ability to feed ourselves, to manufacture our own vehicles, computers, and hardware, then we've lost the ability to be non-dependent and consequently sovereign, thus free. The beautiful truth of the matter is, America has both the talent and the capability of being fully self-sufficient without the need for imports and exports. Would it hit the cash flow? Initially. But in the aggregate of the nation, it would be a net benefit and would naturally reinforce reciprocity, watering the plant of a sovereign and free nation. There can be no shortcuts, nor should we wish for any, unless we desired arriving back to where we currently are, facing a technocracy that would eventually equal slavery to any meaningful use of that term. If we want to keep our values, God, family, and freedom, then it's obvious by this point that we cannot afford the luxuries of ignorance, i.e. dependency on foreign interests for goods, services, and people, as long as those interests are ultimately global governance interests. Aside from the political work that needs to be done, the final, but perhaps even more urgent issue is that of production. I consider these points the baseline we need to achieve in the coming years. Protecting agriculture and supporting organic food. Protecting internal trade and revenue via external tariffs. Protecting internal incomes via reduced taxation, including sales and state. Protecting the dollar via Federal Reserve restrictions. Protecting manufacturing via incentivized apprenticeships instead of university. Protecting the medical industry via ensured domestic production and restricted application. Taking back control of our agriculture and trade to a more domestically pointed reciprocal arrangement would dramatically move the dial in our freedom from incoming totalitarianism. As individuals, we must also take back control by reducing our dependency on systems that no longer serve us. If we need to buy from the drug dealer to quell the pain of a serious injury, we could take solace in desperation. But if we're regularly approaching the drug dealer out of hedonism alone, we have little self-respect remaining to terminate that relationship. We should only rely on international economies as a necessity, not as a luxury. As a people and as individuals, we must become more self-sufficient. Support local businesses first, state economy second, and national economy last. Grow your own food. Get to know your neighbors. Learn useful skills, practical and technical. We can take back control of America peacefully in a few simple daily actions en masse. Non-compliance with unlawful and unconstitutional directives. Disengage from any and all corporations that support globalism. Remove support for any politician or party that supports anything outlined here, red or blue. Pay closer attention to your local and regional politics. Get involved and begin blocking global governance at City Hall. We're beyond reconciliation with a psychopathic leech that seeks to undermine our very existence. Reclaiming America as a free sanctuary will require us to informally separate our affairs, to focus on reciprocal engagement with our countrymen, to reinforce sovereignty, and expand outwards as we grow in number. We are out of time to continue giving money, votes, and influence to the enemies of all that is holy, and that especially includes churches that are on board with the global state. Individually, don't lie, don't do things you hate, and don't do things that make you hate yourself. The loss of self-respect is the beginning of all tyranny and the beginning of the end of one's own will to live. Love what is good. Love your fellow man when they have shown you no reason not to, and be someone yourself that you would respect if they were someone else. Self-sufficiency means sovereignty, which equals freedom, and self-sufficiency begins with us. 4. Returning to a transcendent mission. If freedom has been hunted around the globe, one tiny step at a time for decades, then sovereignty in 2020 saw a gun to the head. For if what we've discussed here were to come to pass in fulfillment by 2030 and beyond, it'd be a bullet to the head. I want you to really understand this. Global governance, exemplified via Agenda 21 and 2030, seek to undermine everything you care about, everything you love about America, and make no mistake, it will tear through the fabric of anything transcendent and of God we have left, replacing it with meaningless efficiency to keep us slaves in a technocratic future. This is not a game, and not just a fight for America. This is a fight for the whole world, and a fight for what it means to even be human. When living men and women are reduced to nothing but cogs in the machine, removed from being free to carve out their own path in life, restricted from land use and genuine free trade commerce, blocked from any property ownership and denied any privacy, how is that anything but slavery? If sovereignty is the rule, technocracy is the exception. It may seem unreal at the current stage, although I find it hard to believe after what we have witnessed since March 2020. But it's evident from the information presented, all cited on the website, and most of which is available hasn't even been presented, that this is very real. Quote, Alexander Solzhenitsyn from the Gulag Archipelago. Bless you, prison. Bless you for being in my life. For there, lying upon the rotting prison straw, I came to realize that the object of life is not prosperity as we are made to believe, but the maturity of the human soul. What is it then that defines our generation's philosophical woes, and subsequently our political cause? It seems the 21st century zeitgeist is one of identity, be it religious and spiritual, ethnic, national, or individual. All of the above metrics that ordinarily define our inner world and orient us effectively and ethically in the outer world have been put into question to the point of non-importance, almost as if in the middle of the night your house was burgled for all its sentimentality and valuables, leaving only an empty building behind. This is exactly what has happened to Western civilization in particular over the past few decades, and expediently in the last decade. Our inner world has been hollowed out by design, whether that design be operating on instinct, inadvertently, or ideology, advertently, to be replaced by a reimagined idea of man, that is, one's God now be subjective and available for tuning by cultural engineers when the dial needs to be moved to further progress. If one loses their identity, they lose their inherent meaning, soon to follow is their conscious will to seek that which is greater than them, and finally to oppose that which is dangerous to them. It is evident across people, culture, time, and geography that man is wired for the transcendent. That God changes, the instinct doesn't. Technocracy preys upon the innate trait of our seeking higher purpose and offers a worldly alternative to both placate the population and steer the narrative to resemble their instincts. Exemplified with, quote, saving the planet, unquote, instead of saving souls, vis-a-vis climate change. Perhaps young adults today value equality above all, not least because it is drilled into their minds 24/7, where decades ago they may have valued virtue higher, and certainly their sovereignty would have been higher, as the youth once valued autonomy higher than social platitudes. How are these social platitudes going to help them remain focused on being better through the tragedies of life, which will inevitably come for us all? How is equality exactly going to keep you pressing on with life when your father dies? It doesn't at all surprise anyone paying attention why we have a posterity of broken people. Harsh challenges are unavoidable because life is unavoidable, and if one isn't constituted properly in the face of its fierceness, life will win. It is the modus operandi of governance by vice through the manipulation of linguistics to swap a population's higher order value, i.e. justice, for something more relativist like social justice, thus proving the power of linguistics. True justice, as expressed and evolved through the history of Western civilization, arguably having its origins in the Gospels, then through the Magna Carta and English common law to the American Bill of Rights, is an objective position that one must take without bias. Social justice, which is completely predicated on bias, e.g. the West is bad, white people are bad, Christianity is bad, this justice, quote unquote, cannot exist objectively at all, unless those that support it were to concede on ideology. The absolute irony is that they presuppose many of Christ's moral teachings, such as those of universal care, but then invert them to bias, and further make fools of themselves by denigrating Christianity. Of course, Christ required strict ethical boundaries and humility before God as a necessity to universality, both antithetical to globalist social justice, and an obstruction to warping the minds of young adults to favor your totalitarian takeover. The linguistic doublespeak is perhaps most obvious with love, which, rather than defining one's approach to people regardless of circumstance, i.e. having to tell hard truths or punish bad behavior but doing so affectionately, or not taking enjoyment in suffering, it has become permit all behavior regardless of cost. Is it love to reduce my nation's sovereignty and consequently my neighbor's individual rights to solve a near impossible problem like third world poverty, either via monetary theft, debt, or illegal immigration, also debt, at the risk of a total and irreversible change of national axiology? Love is a verb, an action as much as a value, and I, for one, know the world needs more of it. I happen to agree that we should help rebuild parts of the world that are lacking sufficient basic needs, as well as conserve nature where possible. But this can be done without giving absolute authority to global governance via politics, goods, people, and services. We cannot help others if we cannot help ourselves. If we lose our political and economic autonomy, we lose our ability to help the vulnerable around the world with it. Much of the work that needs to be done is preventative. For example, there would be no destroyed Middle East had there not been false justification for invasion to begin with, so there'd be no migration crisis and trillions of dollars of debt increase. If we're serious about bettering the planet for itself and for us, it needs to be done before the fact, and it must involve a longer-term approach than one of instant gratification for empathy's sake. Did you have a vote on the war in Syria? Did you have a vote on allowing unelected climate change organizations to take over your regional politics and steal your tax dollars? The linguistic territory has been ceded to the point where love can mean lose priorities, lose self-respect, and lose sovereignty to pay for the mistakes of globalist leaders' actions in the first place. This is a travesty on the very meaning of transcendent love, which is aligning with the highest good, especially among challengers, and as a prerequisite must coexist with truth. We cannot love if we cannot speak the truth. As expressed in the introduction, it doesn't necessarily have to be theism. The immaterial, eternal laws themselves can grant us enough to at least anchor truth in permanence. Transcendental categories described, such as mathematics, logic, geometry, and cosmology, don't change. We just learn more about them. They are inexorable, unlike the whims of a particular political interest. While one could easily become a sophist by applying the meaning they want to see in these universal laws, making skepticism warranted, it is nonetheless obvious that certain worldviews are more coherently aligned with them. Beyond the worldview, we can then more universally look at principles. You may think Buddha expresses truth better than Jesus, but the fact there is truth, and it is aligned with the nature of reality, is where we all could converge on the transcendent. Once it is understood that there are objective principles at work, we can orient ourselves accordingly, and while values can take many forms, i.e. love is expressed as compassion and gratitude, or boundaries and discipline, they would still have to be true for us to orient ourselves in the world for proper action. Consider a case study of where I believe the West was foundationally and philosophically grounded, and through this divine principle, many others stemmed, including freedom of speech. If our nature of sovereignty is inextricably linked with natural law and the golden rule, our values and our virtue are linked with logos, a transcendent meaning that gave birth to the two most influential yet different schools of thought in the history of Western civilization. Logos, in Greek, means word, reason, or plan. Plural, logi, In ancient Greek philosophy and early Christian theology, logos is the divine reason implicit in the cosmos, ordering it and giving it form and meaning. Logos can be more informally understood as divine truth, that which, if spoken, orders the world correctly. And incarnate, as in the figure of Jesus Christ, is synonymous with the Word of God. It should be no surprise then that Christ said several times that the Holy Spirit in Christianity is the Spirit of truth. John 4:17, 4:23, and Stoic philosophers such as Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius refer to logos as being the seminal reasoning of the universe. Everything else flows from the fountain of truth. The universe is ordered honestly, i.e. logically, and we ought to mirror that. Returning to a transcendent mission requires us at minimum to speak the truth, seek the truth, act honestly, live honorably, warts and all. Reclaim logos, reclaim sovereignty, and reclaim America. Once we have truth on our side, then we can truly act with love, as love without truth isn't really love at all, but pacification at best and cowardice at worst. What did our founding fathers value? Freedom, so they could orient their visions accordingly. Not freedom to degenerate, but to build and grow without tyrannical restraint. Freedom is necessary as the baseline to be allowed to operate under the natural law of free will to begin with. But moral restraints will always manifest politically and be necessary to inhibit bad actors that wish to repress the free will of others. Government in this case is a necessary evil, but one that must be given the same restrictions we would give to ourselves and must give to private companies and interests, as organizations being able to operate outside the Bill of Rights is utter insanity and a violation of law, leading to domestic abuse from technocrats and global governance as defined in Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. A living man or woman losing their link to the transcendent means a pseudo-transcendent goal is put in its place, whether consciously or unconsciously. The internal constitution is emptied, leaving only an external constitution behind. Reclaiming our transcendent link will unequivocally do more to further our political and social ambitions than anything else. Our internal constitution, which is that of being, linked to our values, must be properly constituted to provide the platform for learning and action. This is a heuristic approach, a simplified frame of that which drives man to purpose, and how I'd look at these core traits as they affect us holistically relating to the subject matter. So, ontology, your being, is transcendent and objective. Axiology, your values, are the integrated and subjective. Epistemology, your knowledge, is the input applied. Praxeology, which your action, is your output applied. Notice at every level of the sphere of influence spreading outward and inward, your behavior and your moral philosophy isn't just affecting you, but everyone you'll ever encounter, and it comes back to you the same way from them. This isn't to apply pressure to your growth, but to understand the depth of it and the impact of it. Your actions matter because you matter, and at this juncture perhaps more than any other time in history. Our nature, our being, must ultimately lead to the highest point of awareness, whether you call that God or the peak of cosmological consciousness, as that highest value lays the foundation for the rest. If God is what represents the highest good, then our values represent how we integrate that good into our worldview. Our knowledge represents that which appears true on reason, the input of information downstream from the prior, and our actions align with all of the former and are our output into the world. For example, the Holy Spirit equals the Spirit of truth and is the transcendent principle. Therefore, our integrated value is authenticity. Our knowledge is then evidenced and rational, and our action requires speaking honestly, then doing what we say we're going to do. It may seem complicated, but this is largely what many of our ancestors did for a very long time without understanding the complexities of it, because the mechanics of the philosophy may be complex, but to act it out is natural. Hence, not all the working classes of the, quote, great unwashed masses, unquote, as seen by globalists, have a university degree to tell them that this is how life is, yet they know it anyway and act it out. Logos. Order your life and society according to the highest truths. Sovereignty. Natural law is the golden rule. Don't do to others what you wouldn't have done to you. America. We must protect national sovereignty to uphold individual sovereignty. Truth is the foundation. Love is the action. Sovereignty is the result. and freedom is the reward. I hope I've made my case clear, at least. There is a lot more I could say, and that needs to be explored by all of us. But this letter is to cover the problems and solutions as I see them at a meta level, and to begin the conversation about absolutely, politically and philosophically, rejecting global governance before it's fully manifest. I can't lie, and I'm sure you feel it in your bones, that we have a tough road ahead, and we're in for the fight of our lives. The world has not seen a transition like this since World War II, and if you're awake, you already see it. But in those days, at least, America was mostly non-dependent on global systems, so there was less of a socio-economic vacuum for tyranny. I've no doubt with this paper written, and the work I'm about to engage in, that ankle-biters in the corporate media and their global citizen flock will gather at the gates of my castle with pitchforks. Needless to say, even those that will be made indentured servants in this dystopian future will fight to protect it. Not least because their paycheck often requires it, but because it's all they know, all they feel safe in, and it involves no confrontation. But I'll say to you this: he who avoids confrontation will only amplify it later, and if he can't confront it as a snakelet, what hope has he to face it as a snake? The technocracy leading us into global governance is the most resourceful enemy in the history of the world, the biggest threat in many ways humanity has ever faced, and it will not go down without a fight. If we truly want to reclaim America, to even keep America, we will inevitably make many sacrifices during this decade. Yet, isn't it also wonderful and a gift for it to be our generation that gets to stand up to the formation of a one-world system? Surely the level of threat and power on one side determines the measure of courage on the other side. As life is indeed very short, milliseconds compared to that of the earth we stand on, how do you want to be remembered on your deathbed? In heroism or in sloth? I believe we have been given a gift from God in being able to stand up to menace and smile as we walk through hell, as nothing that is done to us can be worse than the death we do to ourselves when we shrink in obedience to evil. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus Christ, Matthew 5:10. Do the little things that matter so you can do the big things that matter when it matters most. Reject deception wholeheartedly. Reject libel and slander when they come with it, and they will. Embrace truth, because it is on your side, and it'll work with you, break and shape you, as the hand of God carving you can feel like torture until you are a masterpiece on the other side. Embrace your spirit, the real you. Embrace your sovereignty, and embrace the challenges ahead to carving out a new America for the 21st century. History is made of moments like this. To the real, the true, and the good. This is a Declaration of Non-Dependence by Mark Malone. Quote Thomas Paine, Common Sense, 1776. If trouble must come, let it come in my time, so that my children can live in peace.